Hello and welcome to the Outdoorsy Educator podcast, the show where curiosity meets the open road. I'm your host Alistair, and I invite you to join me as we explore the world through travel, nature, getting outside, and the power of learning. Each episode, we will dive into stories from inspiring educators, adventurers, and global citizens who are reshaping what it means to learn, whether it's in a classroom, on a mountain trail, or even halfway across the world. From backpacking trips that change your perspective to educational journeys that transform communities, we will cover it all. So pack your curiosity, lace up your boots, and let's discover how the world teaches us. One step, one story, one adventure at a time. And on this week's episode of the Outdoorsy Educator podcast, we have Dr. Joe Darowski. Joe, how are you today?
I am doing well. How are you?
Yeah, doing very well. We were put in touch through a mutual friend, Steve Mutum. So I'm excited to have this conversation, and he is dying to hear this when it comes out in a few weeks. So I'm excited. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Joe Darowski. I teach English at Brigham Young University, but my area of emphasis is American culture. My PhD is in American Studies, so I do a lot of research into comic books and TV shows and film, as well as teaching classes on the classic, classic canon of literature and things like that. I'm not trying to knock that at all, but my personal area of focus has been much more into popular culture studies
I
in terms
love that. I
where
love
I look
that.
at, yeah.
Yeah, so that's how we've sort of connected again through a mutual friend, Steve. Is I know we both have an adoration and a love for the show Frasier, which is
Fantastic sitcom.
right. We could do a whole extensive podcast just on Frasier. I have featured a couple of times on, I think it is the biggest Frasier podcast called We're Listening. That's how Steve and I initially connected, and then he said, "Yeah, you got to talk to Joe. He's going to have a really interesting perspective on." Culture and how it can relate to education, and that's really what I wanted to start off with. Is we're both in academics, but how does the world of academia, how does that connect to, I'm not quite sure of the right phrase, but culture, especially television culture, movies, TV shows, and is it fair to say your focus is on the 90s, or does it expand beyond that?
It does expand beyond that, but several of my books have been on shows from that era. So I have co-authored a book on Cheers, which the tail end is into the 90s, and then on Frasier, which runs through the 90s and into the early 2000s. Um, but I've done some other projects. I have a book on Survivor, which is a 2000s era show, very or
Yes.
outdoorsy show, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Um, but it's kind of an interesting way that I found myself working in academia, but studying popular culture. When I first applied to grad school, I, on my application, said I was going to study Shakespeare. Uh,
Right. Right.
um, and then I was in the same university where I'd done my undergrad as where I was doing my master's degree, and I ran into a professor for whom I had written a paper on Spider-Man in a class on science fiction. I did a paper on Spider-Man, and he stopped me in the hall and said, I saw that you're in the master's program. If you wanted to do more research on superheroes, I would love to chair your thesis committee. And I had no idea what I was going to, like, I didn't know how to put together a thesis committee yet. Like, that was right after I got in. And I'm like, well, that sounds like a great opportunity. So,
I
um,
love that. Yeah.
I shifted from classics and Shakespeare and British lit to American literature and superhero comic books is what I wrote my master's thesis on, just because of that encounter in the hallway and him remembering a paper that I'd written in one of my undergrad classes. And then when I finished up my master's, it was kind of I don't know what to do with my life. So I applied to a bunch of PhD programs.
Right.
And Michigan State University at the time housed the Journal of Popular Culture. So they did a lot of pop culture studies. And they also have I can't remember the exact title of it, but they have the largest comic book collection in the world in their special collections. They have
Oh,
hundreds of
okay.
thousands of comic books. And so when I applied saying I'm kind of interested in continuing thinking about comic books and long form storytelling that spans decades with, hundreds of authorial voices, and how it changes to reflect the times as the same character stories are being told in different eras. I got into a PhD program. Excuse me.
Hmm.
I got into a PhD program in American Studies at Michigan State and wrote my doctoral dissertation on the X-Men and race and gender in the X-Men and how that ebbed and flowed and the portrayals of those shifted across decades of storytelling, with the X-Men. And at that point, with an American Studies degree and doing major research on comic books, it kind of became cultural studies was my main area rather than literature. Now, as an English professor, I do absolutely still teach the canon. I think there's a huge place in the university and the humanities for those classics, but I think it also warrants looking at what are the popular texts that huge numbers of people are engaging with at a given point, in our history. Like, why does this particular text resonate? Why is this the best? The biggest movie that most people see, and that may be very different than the number of people that read a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, which is fantastic and artistic and has incredible weight and merit to it. But also, what about these massive stories that resonate with millions and sometimes billions of people? Let's think deeply about those too.
I love it. So obviously, a lot of this conversation may come back to the root of Frasier. I also run a Friends podcast with my friend
Oh, okay.
Deanne. Um, and I was trying to think before we got on how to phrase this question, and I haven't quite got it nailed down. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how these sitcoms, TV shows, even comic books, movies, whatever it is, tie into the culture of the time. A lot of the time when I talk about sitcoms, whether it's Friends, Frasier, or something else, it often comes up, oh, would that joke land today? If the
Hmm.
writers were writing this show in 2025, would they have included that joke? Is that still something that we can tease about in a joking way, but maybe culture has shifted? So I was wondering
Yeah.
if you could talk a little bit to that and how these things you've studied, these comic books, TV shows you've
Hmm.
studied, tie into the time they were written.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are things that don't age well, and that's
Yeah.
things that were just not just acceptable, but were considered the like common sense take on things that shifts. And I sometimes talk about this with my students, and I say, yes, there's some discomfort when we look at these older texts, and there's depending on how old we're talking about, like there's open racism or homophobia or what it may be. But I also say, let's think about that also in light of how far we've come, that our immediate reaction now is discomfort with that. That
Right.
says something that there has been improvement in our society. There's still plenty of room to change, and things that we're making now are absolutely going to have a similar reaction 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50 years down the road. People are going to look back and say, wow, that was really
Yeah.
that was like acceptable, and not just acceptable, but normalized to have that particular attitude. Like those shifts are always happening in a culture, and when we're looking back at these older pieces of pop culture, those are locked in time, right? But us as
Hmm.
audiences, we're not. And even we as individual people, when we engage with a piece of culture, like at different points in our lives, we're going to have wildly different reactions to it because we ourselves have changed, even though that thing, is the same. Like the movie Home Alone, when you watch it as
Yes.
a kid, you think like, oh, like how fun would that be, to be alone?
Right.
And then there like comes a point where suddenly you're like, what do his parents do for their jobs? How do they afford this
Right.
particular house? And you don't even think about that as a kid. But then like the next stage is thinking about like, oh, that's gonna hurt. Like they're gonna have a lot of doctor bills. That's gonna be long term. Like you start to think
Right.
about the pain
Right.
and the
The
aches.
homeowner's insurance claims and things. Yes.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
and that text is there, but we as an audience shift, or even like I remember when I was in grad school, that's when my wife and I had our first baby. And I had a stack of comics that I've been meaning to get to, but I hadn't gone to, and we had our baby like right as we entered a long break in the academic calendar. So I'm like, oh, this will be fantastic. I was literally holding my baby in arms when I read a comic book, and it was about a newborn baby in peril. And if I'd read that one week before, I would have had a very different reaction than reading it holding my newborn. Like I had changed. The comic
Of
was sitting there on that
course.
stack, but I was in a different place emotionally, and just in my life experience. And as a culture, we go through these changes and transformations, and those texts stay where they were. And we can have discomfort with them, and there are absolutely jokes that we would not make today that are there in some of these older sitcoms when we go look at them. But that's not always a thing where we should look back and denigrate the artists for what they did then. Maybe we should celebrate where we are now. That, oh, we have immediate discomfort. That means we have evolved.
Right, and that's something that maybe, as you've alluded to, should be celebrated rather than
Hmm.
just focusing on the discomfort. When I was thinking about this today, there was a couple of examples that jumped out at me in my mind when I've felt torn. I wouldn't say discomfort because just because I thought something was funny in the 90s doesn't mean I should feel guilty about it now, because I
Hmm.
have hopefully grown and evolved. Um, there's numerous examples throughout Frasier because of the camp nature of some of the main characters. One that often jumps out at me is Daphne refers to her transvestite uncle. In one scene, she just mentioned him
Hmm.
in San Francisco. That's a term that wouldn't be used now. Um,
Yeah.
you're right or wrong, it's not about that, but it's just how things have evolved. But I often think about the show Will and Grace and how different that appears to me. I don't know the show terribly well. I've seen most of it, I think.
Hmm.
To sort of celebrate and look at almost the acceptance of two gay men, living in New York, appear to me to be living their best life without much homophobia. I'm sure there is some in there that they deal with. I just don't remember examples.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yes,
Well, I know the premise and I've read about it, but I haven't watched a
right.
lot of that show. Hmm.
Okay, it always just struck me as one that was very positive
Hmm.
with regards to homosexuality,
Yeah, and I've
and
read some
then
interviews with the
yes.
creators, and I know that was their goal,
Oh,
right?
okay, you know more than I do there. That's
Hmm.
interesting. It certainly comes across like that. And then I think of Friends because I'm doing, as I said, an episode by episode rewatch. And while it's not in any way sort of anti-gay, which seems like a very odd thing to say, there's a couple of jokes in there that certainly wouldn't be made now and do make me feel,
Hmm.
they make you kind of gasp your breath in a little
Yeah.
bit and go, oh, that's not good.
Hmm.
So it's very interesting that these shows often lived at the same time, and maybe it's because of my age, and I was born in 1981, so 90s television for me was very influential. But I do feel it really was a crossroads of, maybe coming out of some of the now what we would phrase as off-color jokes and not appropriate jokes to acceptance.
Yes, I think there's absolutely in that '90s era. Something is happening that's different.
Hmm.
Like I said, I wrote a book on Cheers, and there's a whole episode where, and this would be early '80s. This episode of Cheers, it's from maybe the second season, if I'm remembering right. But one of Sam Malone's old baseball buddies comes out as gay, and Sam doesn't immediately like has him. He's there doing a book launch at the bar, and that's when he announces this, and Norm and Cliff come across as incredibly homophobic. Like they're worried about the bar is going to become a
Uh,
gay bar, and like these are the beloved weird uncles of the TV show,
yes.
and and
Right.
they're expressing like pretty openly homophobia about this. Now later on in that run, there's a whole episode also where Norm decides he's going to pretend to be gay because he's really good at interior design, and some people that hired him to do interior design are shocked when they find out that he's straight, and he's like, I'd rather keep the job, so I'll just
Right.
so there's like a shift there. And then when we get to Frasier, there are obviously lots of gay jokes in Frasier, but there's
Yeah.
a different flavor to those gay jokes, and one that
Yes.
like led to them winning awards from GLAAD and other groups, because like they would do a romantic farce where they used the fact that one character is gay as just another bit of confusion. It wasn't like the joke wasn't they are
Right.
gay. The joke is the confusion that comes from someone assuming someone is gay and not knowing that someone else is gay. And that's a different kind of comedy than what you saw in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, where like the punchline would be that person's gay, and that's the whole joke, and everyone's supposed to laugh at that.
Right.
Right now,
Right.
with something like Frasier, the fact that someone is gay is just part of the farce, not the punchline.
I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. It often causes me to have moments of self-reflection because is it really offend or some of the things, over the 80s and 90s in the
Mhm.
sitcom world, are they really offensive? Am I taking that something as offensive when really to perhaps somebody who may be gay? You brought up Glad. They obviously didn't see a lot of the Frasier, farcical scenes as offensive, I would assume,
Mhm.
having
Yeah.
given awards. So I find I sometimes sort of mull over this. Am
Hmm.
I finding something offensive that maybe isn't actually offensive to the person I am perceiving it to offend?
Right.
and that sort of thing. So it's maybe not the show itself; it's how I'm actually perceiving it.
Hmm.
It can be very different from the way it was intended.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of introspection is valuable. It's
Mm-hmm.
worth doing it. I think when I study popular culture, like there are some people like within academia who are sometimes like, is that worth studying? Like we should only be talking about the classics. I definitely run into that kind of attitude. But then there
Mm-hmm.
are also some people who aren't, and they're saying that because it's disposable. Like, is it worth studying? And then there are some people who are also like, well, I just want to check out and enjoy this thing and not think deeply about it. you know,
Right,
and so like
right.
I get it sometimes from both ends of the spectrum. Like, why are you thinking deeply about this thing? I don't want to have to think deeply about the thing I love. And other people are like, well, why would you think deeply about that bit of cultural ephemera that was made to be disposable, that was made just to be consumed and then for kind of forgotten, and it's not a timeless
Mm-hmm.
classic in their minds. But again, I think there's value in being willing to put in some of that work and some of these texts where there's artistry and craftsmanship and performance and writing that warrants it. That introspection can be very rewarding, but also as an audience member to be willing to put in that time to do the work that you're thinking of, like, okay, like I felt a little bit of discomfort, why? That's
Right.
going to change our experience as consumers, but I think there's value in doing that, and not just kind of passively consuming all the media that's there around us. There's so much that's there around us. Like we have more media at our fingertips than any generation in the history of the world, right?
Right.
There's just so much that's there, and being willing to be thoughtful consumers of that media, I think that's an important skill set to develop when there is so much that is out there.
So that's a skill set I did not have. I mean, I've watched Friends and Frasier in particular passively as comfort shows, as many, many people
Hmm.
have. And then when I became more involved in We're Listening, and my friend Deanne and I, in fact, Steve, our mutual friend, was on 2 episodes of the Purple Door podcast, my friend's rewatch pod. It's been very interesting to not only watch the show through that different lens of examining it a little more rather than just, as you said, as passive entertainment,
Hmm.
but to really look at some of the deeper meanings. And even things, this came up a few weeks ago when we were watching an episode of Friends, smoking, which is pretty black and white, how in the 80s people were smoking indoors.
Hmm.
Frasier, there was, I cannot remember the episode now, but I remember at least at times people were smoking indoors, but Frasier would request that they go out to the balcony.
Hmm.
Smoking became, we dug into this a little. In New York, it was around the year 2000-ish, smoking became banned indoors. And then now you would never see somebody smoking indoors on a
Yeah.
sitcom, as far as I can tell. And it just,
Hmm.
sometimes it gives me moments to pause and reflect on how society changes. Certainly in this case, and in most cases, I would hope for the better. But
Hmm.
sometimes possibly not. I'm not quite sure. Have you ever come across examples where you think, people are maybe trying too hard to be politically correct in media? And to me, that I imagine that might backfire on what they're trying to do.
Yeah, where it starts to feel preachy.
Yeah.
Like it feels like we're stepping outside of the story or the characters to say a message. Like there can be fantastic messages that are delivered when it's interwoven with a narrative and interwoven with like the reality of the characters that they've created so far. But definitely there are, whether it's a special episode from the 90s, or whatever, there are
Right.
moments where it feels like the creators are stopping the purpose of the show to tell the audience what to think about a subject. And
Right.
that feels very clunky and it feels very preachy to the audience and it causes, I think, moments of resistance. Whereas when the theme is integral to the plot and also feels earned for those characters, I think those messages can be delivered in thoughtful ways and artistic ways that don't feel like we're being given a spoonful of medicine. And
Right.
there's I completely understand the impulse of a creator or an artist saying I have an issue I want to speak on, but when that becomes kind of um, a Shakespearean turn to the audience and direct the audience monologue in a venue that hasn't been that has never had that, that's I think where it can feel like maybe a bit of a misfire for the show.
That's it. It's coming back to Will and Grace. They rebooted the show several years ago. Don't quite remember when
Mhm.
now. I have not seen the reboot at all, but one article I read about it said that it did descend into that a little bit with regards to politics. Just
Hmm.
one too many cracks and jokes, very clearly showing the writer's political opinion,
Right.
and it felt forced to
Hmm.
this one journalist, this one reviewer anyway. And I thought, I'd like to watch that and see if I picked up and catch the same feelings that they did about it. It's on my extensive to watch list.
Yes.
That
Yeah,
is
the pile of media to get to is more than I will get to in my lifetime.
right. I think we know it's just endless. Yes.
Yeah.
So again, we touched on this Frasier. We've connected through sort of the Frasier worldwide
Hmm.
network a little bit. Is that a show that is particularly something you enjoy? If so, what do you enjoy about it? What the meaning of the show to you?
So it's one of the first shows that was like a sitcom for adults that I saw when I had to have been like 13 or 14. And it was my oldest sister, who was probably a senior in high school at the point, and she just said, and this will date me because I was born in 1982.
Okay, similar,
uh,
similar, similar age, vintage. Yes.
she had there was a family computer in one room, and then she actually had a computer to do homework on. And it was basically like you could do word processing. That's the level of computer we're
Yes.
talking about.
Yes.
But there was one night where the other computer was being used by a different kid who had to do homework, and she said, "Fine, you can use mine." And she was watching Frasier, and I definitely was like stopping to watch. And she said something about, "I think you'd like this show," and I was just like, something was clicking, where I'm like,
Mhm.
"There's an intelligence to this humor that's different,
Right.
right?" Um, and I was a kid that was in drama, like I was doing a Shakespeare play, like I was fascinated with the idea of the world of storytelling, and immediately I was like, there's something different, and so then I started to do homework, quote unquote, in on that computer every Thursday when Frasier was on.
Right. It just coincidentally, yes.
Yes, yeah, yeah, exactly, and she knew exactly what was going on. She was like, "Yeah, come watch Frasier," and then. Um, it was something that I was definitely watching. And then in college, so I was an English major and what was called a theater and media arts minor, so studying film and television for my minor. And I can't remember if it was for a paper or what, but I was starting to dig into Frasier a little bit more, and I showed my younger sister, like just passing it on. I said I was home one time, and I said to my younger sister, "Watch some of this. It's the best writing you're going to see on television." And she fell in love with Frasier, and that's who co-authored the book on Frasier with me, was my younger sister.
Oh, I
Um,
did not. I wasn't aware of that. That's wonderful.
yeah, and so that sister and I, when I was in, I just finished my PhD, and I was talking with a publisher at a conference, and I mentioned that I had this idea about writing about class issues and Frasier, but there would certainly be other things that I'd write about as well. And so they said, send us a proposal. And so I talked to my sister, and the reason I talked to my sister, she was getting her master's in the history of design uh, from from Parsons in New York. And I knew I was going to have to write about Frasier's apartment and the chair. And I'm like, that's not like I'm studying race and gender and class in pop culture. That's something I'm very comfortable with. Uh,
Right.
but
It's a skill
talking,
I'm developing. Yes.
yeah, I had classes that trained me. I understood some of the theory, and I've learned a lot more since then. But writing about like chair design and the the elements of Frasier's apartment, I need my sister who has a master's in the history of design, because we have a whole chapter about
Ah,
like there's a whole section about Martin's chair and the history of chair and like the Eames chair that he replaces with Martin's chair. My sister knew about like the history of the Eames chair and what that was as a piece of design, and so I was like, I need you to help co-write this book on Frasier.
I love that. I love the family collaboration on it.
Yeah.
And the more I get into looking at these shows through this, podcasty lens, the more I
Hmm.
nerd out about this stuff. I've got to be honest. I
Yeah.
love looking at the set design in particular because some is a coincidence. There's no meaning to it, but man alive, there's so
Oh,
much, so
yeah.
many
The Frasier's apartment
Easter
in
eggs.
particular. Yeah,
Yes.
Frasier's apartment has so much, and she was able to find out and write about like so many of the pieces of art that were in there, and the knickknacks, and the Chuhili glass sculpture that's there,
Mm-hmm.
and she knew like the cultural weight of those things, but also why they're being put in this apartment, what they're trying to say about the characters, and so like that was incredibly important. Her insights into the craft and care that the set designers had, and the set decorators had in creating the look and feel of Frasier's apartment. Like that's one of the things that I realized. It's not just the amazing performances of David Hyde Pierce, or Perry Gilpin, or
Hmm.
it's not just those performances, and it's not just the writers giving them great lines. It's the fact that the set design was immaculate. Like they had everyone giving 100%, and that makes the best episodes feel like 110% of great.
Right.
When that care is throughout all the layers of creation of a sitcom episode.
Absolutely. And I think of, and we're going to getting into the Frasier niche here a little bit, but when we visit like Cam Winston's apartment, which
Hmm.
is, the same, he's one floor up, I think one floor up. Structurally the same, but then so very different. And then the scene where his name has escaped me, the young station manager comes in and
Oh
decides he
yeah,
wants to live like Frasier, essentially.
mhm.
And there's
The
all
Alan
this
Tudyk cameo.
redecoration.
Yeah,
Yeah, his name
yeah.
Todd. Is it Todd? Perhaps it's Todd.
Oh, I think it's not. Yeah, I
It
just remember it
might
as
be.
Alan Tudyk.
Yes,
It's just
exactly.
funny.
It's like trying to remember the character.
Yeah.
Um, and it's one of the few times
Or
I
when you
think.
see Niall's old money, right? When he's at the end with Maris's old
Yes.
money, like that's a different kind of wealth than Frasier's newer money,
Right.
right?
It's very deliberate. And I sometimes think the Montana reflects
Mhm.
that a little bit. The
Yes.
dark wood, it's got that, it's a
Hmm.
lot more aged.
Hmm.
And I do love it. Yeah, with Todd, when, Frasier, there's this, I don't know, 30-second scene where his apartment changes decoration 10 times with the music playing over. I love that little insight into Frasier's psyche of the set decoration, and okay, all very deliberate, I'm sure, as he's trying to
Hmm.
re-identify himself through different decor.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's such an interesting thing. Well, I must confess, I was unaware of your writings until a few weeks ago. And of course,
Hmm.
I've looked at Amazon and I've already thought, well, I'm definitely getting the Frasier book. If nothing else, there'll be that. But I think that segues quite nicely into if people are interested in this topic, in this subject, in your writing, what's the best way for them, A, to perhaps ask you a question if they have it, to get in touch with you, and B, where to find your books?
Yeah, so my books are on most booksellers,
Hmm.
websites. Amazon definitely will have them. A lot of my work has been published with Roman Littlefield has done my TV work, and then there's a publisher called McFarland that's done a lot of my superhero stuff. So
Right.
those two publisher websites, and the TV books I've done are part of a series called A Cultural History of Television. So if you have a different favorite TV show, it's possible they'll have a book. There's a book on Friends in that cultural history of
Ah,
television.
very nice. I'll get that one
Yes.
too. Right.
And so that's part of that particular line. I also do host a weekly podcast called the Protagonist Podcast, where each week we talk about a great character and a great story. And we just try and rotate through my guest interests, have a different guest on, have them talk about a favorite book or a favorite TV show and a favorite character from there. And I've been doing that for 10 years now. So there's a lot of
Wow.
episodes there. So if you have a favorite TV show or book or movie or comic book, I very likely have done an episode on it. But if not, you can definitely reach out. I am on Twitter and Blue Sky, both just at Darowski, and I can get messages there.
Fantastic. And I'll put links in our show notes when this episode comes out, and I will certainly start following and listening to the Protagonist podcast because the more I get into this, the more I find it just fascinating. As
Well,
we
one
dig
of the
into.
most recent episodes we just did was on Friends, and I will confess, even though I have written books on 90s sitcoms, those were the first episodes of Friends I saw all the way through. Just somehow in my life,
Right.
I never got into Friends, and like I could have named like on the episode, I'm like, here's everything I know about these characters. And my sister who had seen the whole series, the one that I've co-written books, she was
Hmm.
the guest on that episode when we were talking about Friends. She's like, you were right on everything, and it's just through cultural
Right.
osmosis I've taken in Friends. Now some of that is also like when I was working on the Frasier book, there's an oral history of NBC 1990 sitcoms, and I read the whole thing. So I read a whole chapter on Friends, or an oral history of
Right.
Friends, without ever having seen a full episode of Friends.
That's so
Uh,
interesting to have that perspective on it. Um,
yeah.
yeah, knowing some of the backstory but not having seen the episodes. That's
Uh-huh.
really interesting. Yeah, I can see myself ordering a few of these. That's fantastic. Well, as we kind of round the corner here to the home stretch, I could talk to you for hours about this, but it's always a goal of mine to try and keep these podcasts relatively bite-sized and knowing that people have questions, they can reach out to me to put them in touch with you or just reach out to you on Twitter and Blue Sky directly. But I've got three quick questions for you as we wrap this up. Um, Leaning back on academia and also relating it to your work related to cultural writing, how has your definition of success changed over the years?
Oh my goodness, I was just writing a paragraph about this.
Oh, really?
Like
Right.
success. There's so many ways to think about success, and whether that's for an individual or for if you're an artistic creator, because obviously like what you're doing in your life, success is going to be very different. But I was writing about the GI Joe franchise. I think is when I was looking at
Right.
this. And success could be instant recognition. It could be longevity. It could be a deep, people finding deep connection with a particular work. It could also be being having a wide audience,
Right.
that enjoys the work. And GI Joe's kind of had all of those that have happened. I mean, even like my work with the X-Men, like the X-Men failed when it launched, as a comic
Ah,
book series, which is very weird to think about now because it's one of the most famous franchises that's out there for
right.
superheroes.
Right.
But when it launched in the 1960s, it kind of limped along and then got canceled.
Really? I had no
And
idea.
then in 1975, it got relaunched with a new vision. It was an international group. It was an interracial group. In the 1960s, it was all white Americans, which again, reflection of the times
Right.
when it was going
Right.
on. And then 1975, it gets relaunched and builds to become the most popular comic book franchise of the 70s and 80s. But there's no like wider media. It's still like a very comic book oriented thing where like you have to go into the comic book space to discover the X-Men. And it's not till the 2000s that it reaches the film, the massive audience that film is able to reach. And so like it's had these stages of failures and success throughout its time as a franchise, depending on what you want to call success. Like maybe some of the most um artistically successful runs weren't as well known or haven't reached as big an audience as the film, but you also for the owners of the IP, they want to have that big broad audience that film is able to create.
Right.
And so, what is success? Is it telling the most tight, artistic, thematically significant story, but not finding a huge audience? Is it finding a huge? I don't know. I don't know. Success
Right.
is so multifaceted.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I started this podcast 7 or 8 months ago, and my friends one about a year ago. So it's been quite nice at this time of year to have some reflection. I didn't have any idea what success meant in terms of the podcasts
Hmm.
a year ago. But now, for example, my friends one has grown. We have a nice audience, but it's the individual messages I've received, sprinkled throughout the last 6 months to a year, just saying, I really enjoy your podcast. Thank you for doing this every week. That means so much more than I thought it would have if you'd asked me a year ago, how will you feel if one person sends a message? And
Yeah.
then with this podcast, the Outdoorsy Educator, meeting people. I had no idea quite how impactful it would be to meet so many people from so many walks of life on a personal level. Again, it's growing. Things are going well
Hmm.
in terms of numbers, but it's funny how I don't really think about that anymore, and I thought I would.
Oh
It's
yeah.
much more internal than I if you'd asked me a year ago, than I would have thought.
Oh, I can't agree more with the podcasting space where
Yeah.
I'm like when I started doing my podcast, that's right. It was 10 years ago. It's right when podcasts were starting to get big, and
Mhm.
I very quickly realized like reaching a large listenership isn't going to be part of this. And even like I tell other people when they're starting podcasts, I'm like, you need to find some sense of personal fulfillment to keep doing this. Don't view it
Mhm.
as a second job or a revenue stream or a way to get known
Right.
or anything like that. If you get personal fulfillment, keep doing it, and you're going to love doing it. And you're going to make great connections, like you said. You're going to have interesting people come on your podcast. You're going to
Mhm.
get the chance to go on other podcasts. And
Yep.
if that has value for you and is fulfilling for you, you're going to love doing podcasting. But if you're viewing this as like this is a way to get your voice out there and get known, and I'm like, I don't think you're gonna last very long because it's a long, slow process. But then you start to get those personal connections, those
Right.
messages, the thank yous, and it's like, oh, okay, someone, someone is out there listening. This is reaching someone and
Yes.
has some merit
Yeah.
besides the personal fulfillment of digging into
Yes.
something and talking about something that you love, right?
Exactly. Just this last weekend, so I live in the Dallas area, and I was driving through Texas, and I interviewed somebody on the podcast a couple of months ago, and we've become farm friends online, but I was driving through the city where he lives and said, "Hey, would you like to get breakfast?" And it was so nice. It was such a nice thing that this friendship, we've become very good friends, was born from the idea of this podcast, and it's connected us. And I'll take that over an extra 500 listeners on a report any day of the week. Give me those
Yeah.
friendships, those connections. Certainly, without being too philosophical, makes my life better having more of that,
Hmm.
more of those connections, especially in a day and an age where it's very easy to isolate yourself. Um, I'm finding more and more reward in those things, and that's kind of what success is framed in.
I really like that
Yeah.
definition that you have there.
Yeah, it's something I find myself thinking about quite a lot. I am going to put you on the spot here,
Hmm.
um, and I think the important word is impactful, so not favorite. But I was wondering what might be the most impactful television show and comic book franchise that have shaped your work.
Comic book franchise, I can tell you right away, it's X-Men.
Okay,
Because the first comic book I ever read was an X-Men comic book. I was in
right.
a grocery store back when they had spinner racks in the 80s, and my mom, I am sure to make me be quiet while she was doing her grocery shopping, said I could get a comic book, and I grabbed an X-Men comic book, and that ended up being what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. And
I love that so much.
yeah,
Yes.
that random moment in a grocery store has definitely like I can point to that piece of media as having an outsized impact on my life compared to any other bit of media that I've ever gotten.
Oh,
Um,
right. In
and
terms
then
of a
for
television show.
oh, most impactful, um, there's so many different ways to think about impactful, kind of like success.
Yes,
So
yes.
I'm a little bit torn. Um, yeah, it may go back to Frasier because that was the first one that I wrote academically on in terms of TV shows was Frasier. So it just where it's not just my fandom, which is that's a show that I've rewatched the whole series more than once, but it
Right.
became part of my professional identity and my professional career. I probably would have to say Frasier, but then I also think back like some of the first reason I wanted to study or get into film and television at all was because of like Jim Henson things and Muppets and
Right.
like in high school, I remember I wrote a paper on Jim Henson and the Muppets, and I got a lot of praise from my teacher. I think because she had been reading a lot of other papers about like diseases, and it was depressing. And then she got to one about Jim Henson and the
Right.
Muppets, but it was kind of like I think there's kind of something cool in writing about the things we love, right? And
Right.
writing about, um, thinking about entertainment, which yeah, I mean, we mentioned before, like there is absolutely valid time to say I'm checking out and I just want a show that I can relax to and I don't have to think deeply about.
Hmm.
That is a valid thing to have as a mechanism or part of our lives. Part of what we do. And, it's been a hard
Right.
day. I want to try something that's just gonna make me laugh. And no, I don't want to be thinking about like the gender implications or the racial
Right.
implications
Right.
of the show. I am not saying don't do that, but I that's when I started to discover that there was also value in saying I am gonna think more about this. Was Jim Henson and the Muppets? So that's another one.
I love it. Well, yeah, I had some fun. My final question that I ask guests who take up space in the outdoor industry is often, if you could go hiking with somebody for 10 miles, anyone in the world, who would it be?
Mhm.
But I thought it might be fun to ask you if you're sitting there, I'm assuming in your office at work, and
Sure.
if anybody in the world, dead or alive, somebody you know, don't know, anybody, could walk in that door and say, Joe, I want you to or turn me into a comic book hero and write a comic book based on me and my life. You
Oh.
have artistic liberty. Have at it. Who do you think you would like to walk in the door that you could turn into a comic book hero?
Um, I know this is like recency bias of a project I was working on, and it's not fair because there are other comics about this person. But I was just thinking deeply about Jack Kirby, who is a core comic book creator.
Mhm.
Like we think about Stanley as kind of like the grandfather of comic books,
Mhm.
right? Because of all his
Right.
cameos in Marvel Comics. Jack Kirby was co-creating most of the characters with Stanley. Steve Ditko, there was some other ones, but like Jack Kirby's life is just so interesting. Like he was drawing comics before World War II. He co-created Captain America before the U.S. entered the
Right.
war. Then he fought in World War II. Then he came back and ends up co-creating the foundation of the Marvel Universe with Stan Lee. And there's debates. I'm not trying to touch the debates about how much who deserves creative responsibility. Well, I'm just gonna say they co-created a lot of the Marvel Universe together. and he then is going to be advocating for artists' rights as like he sees what we talked about, like society shifting. He sees society shift so much while he's doing this career that when he starts, like there's no sense that any of this is going to have any value. It's just like, what's the next job? I'm just moving from job to job,
Right.
and then by the end of his career and his life, like all of his original art would have been worth tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for every single piece of those, and no one had thought to save them, and Marvel, like there's a whole history of Jack Kirby's lost art, but also like the idea that, okay, I'm making the X-Men, or I'm making the Avengers, or I'm making the Incredible Hulk. It's like, this is just my gig for these next 2-3 years, and then there's gonna be the next fad that we chase, and then but to see that become something that endures and becomes foundational for generations of cultural literacy. Like you need to know
Right.
his creations to be culturally literate today. Like there's just something fascinating about Jack Kirby. And again, I'm gonna fully own some of that as recency bias. That's a thing I've been working on very recently. Was talking about his work. I appeared on an episode of a podcast called the Omnibus Podcast, talking about Jack Kirby's lost art. But that was the first name that popped to mind
Right.
when you asked that question.
And that's what I was hoping you would go with, is, not, even though it can be these questions can be broad, what's your gut say? So I
Hmm.
love that. I love that that's the first name. Well, Joe, I mean, I'm going to be getting online and ordering a couple of these books. Hopefully, we've inspired some listeners too. But I cannot thank you enough for your time. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Oh, I very much enjoyed this. Thank you for reaching out and inviting me to come on.
Thank you again to this week's guest, and I hope today's episode was as enjoyable for you as it was for me, and perhaps even inspired your next adventure. If you did enjoy the show, please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find more information at theoutdoorseyeducator.com, or follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook. Until next time, thank you so much for listening to the Outdoorsy Educator podcast.